You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 18th of February 2025 on Monocle Radio.
Do we now have some idea of what Russia might settle for? The European country benefiting from a practical approach to immigration, and is all publicity attracted by a tourism campaign necessarily good publicity? I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Yasmin Abdul-Majid and Stephen Dalziel will discuss the day's big stories. And as Europe scrambles to keep up with the Gulf as a centre of diplomatic power, we'll meet the former Italian foreign minister who now oversees relations between the EU and the Gulf states. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by Yasmin Abdul-Majid, the Sudanese Australian writer and broadcaster, and Stephen Dalziel, Russia analyst and regular Monocle Radio contributor. Hello to you both.
Hello.
Hello.
And for the light introductory banter portion of the programme, we have been gifted a theme of woolen wear. You are both wearing distinctive woolen items. Stephen, you first. You are wearing a scarf, which strongly suggests to me that from here you are attending a football match of some description.
You're absolutely right. It is the top of the table clash. Never mind the Champions League. This is the top of the National League. That's the league below the four divisions of what we call the Football League.
And one league above jumpers for goalposts.
Absolutely, one league above that. And it's Barnet versus York. And come on, Barnet. Now, of course, my main team is Arsenal. I also happen to have an Arsenal jumper on. But if you live in North London, you're allowed to support Arsenal. Some people support Tottenham, but we don't talk about them. But you can support Arsenal and Barnet because they're so far apart that they're unlikely to meet in competition. So tonight it's come on Barnet.
Well, I would ask you what time kickoff is, but of course it depends what time you get there. Yasmin, you are wearing a jumper which is distinctively associated with a particular part of the United Kingdom.
That's right. I am wearing a Fair Isle jumper or cardigan. And it's a distinctive, anyone who's really into knitting will kind of know the Fair Isle pattern. Mm-hmm. It's, in fact, they did try to get that the insignia or to sort of copyright it or whatever the version of that is for a place like Harris Tweed has, a special mark or whatever. Mm. But for some reason, Fair Isle was not allowed. And apparently it's quite close to a Japanese. Anyway, clearly I know a lot about knitting. Even though I had a conversation with someone, there are still a few people on the island that do knit. And I did manage to persuade someone to sell me this jumper, even though she actually does professionally sell sweaters. She didn't really want to sell it to me. I'm not quite sure why. But somebody else on the island, when I was sort of talking about, my love of knitting and so on, she said, well, there are those of us who are hobbyists. And I thought, well, yeah, but the way you said it, I didn't realise it was a cuss.
So you're painting a portrait of the Fair Isle as somewhere between passive-aggressive and outright hostile.
I mean, to be fair, if you're not messing with their sweaters, they're darling people. But
well, all our listeners who were thinking of making a visit to the Fair Isle may consider themselves duly warned. But we will start in Riyadh, which has today been hosting the highest-level contact between the United States and Russia since Russia embarked upon its 72-hour lightning conquest of Ukraine a little less than 3 years ago. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has met Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. Both have subsequently made positive statements about the prospect of further discussions to come, though the only concrete agreement for now appears to be one about both countries restoring respective ambassadors to Washington, D.C. and Moscow. Stephen, are we learning anything yet about what Russia will settle for, or does Russia sort of seem more interested in what they can sucker Donald Trump into giving up?
Not long ago, Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, as you mentioned, came out and said, we will not accept any NATO troops on Ukrainian soil. So that is one in the eye for the British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, who said just last week that he would be prepared to send British troops, although it's sparked a row about, well, we haven't got any. But as far as I can see, the Russian position won't change at all. And why should it when the Americans have given everything away? When the new Defence Secretary, Pete Hegseth, went to NATO last week, it made me think I would not want to play bridge with this man, because he just put all his cards on the table straight away and said that Ukraine wouldn't get any of its territory back. He basically gave in to all the Russian demands before any negotiations. It's a very strange way to start negotiating. And then Donald Trump came out and said, I've spoken to Putin and he told me he wants peace, and I believe him. Anyone who believes anything Putin says is not on the same planet, because Putin lies and lies and lies, as indeed does Lavrov. So I think that Russians are rubbing their hands with glee that the fact that this meeting is taking place, that they're talking about exchanging ambassadors with the Americans. They've done nothing to deserve it. Let's not forget, they started a war 3 years ago. Indeed, in 2014, they started the first phase of it. But in 2022, they invaded Ukraine totally on false pretenses. They talked about Nazis running the country and so on. They've bombarded Ukraine endlessly, the civilian population. They have done nothing to deserve anyone giving them any favours, and yet here are the Americans apparently bending over backwards to say, let's not only make peace in Ukraine, but kiss and make up and have normal relations once again.
There's a few things there I want to come back to, but before I do, Yasmin, that specific point of Sir Keir Starmer talking yesterday about the prospect of sending British troops to Ukraine, and today walking it back somewhat by saying that only a US security guarantee is really meaningful, which is, unfortunately, I suspect, a fairly blunt statement of the obvious. But are we seeing, though, perhaps on both sides, trying to find some wiggle room in which, when Lavrov says no NATO troops in Ukraine, could he possibly saying, but yeah, look, if people want to send their own troops but not as a NATO mission, we might kind of look the other way then, though that does then raise all sorts of exciting arguments about whether they'd be covered by Article 5 or not. Is everybody basically, I'm trying to be positive and optimistic, is everyone trying to find a fudge they can live with here?
I think so. I mean, that's what it kind of seems like, because as you say, Stephen, it's not like the way that the US is currently playing this is much more about their domestic politics, right? Their domestic perspective is like, we need to end this war. Trump sort of made the promise that he would end the war in Ukraine, and he wants to sort of be seen. He's much more interested in the headlines that he can make in his own domestic market. And so for him, I think everybody else is trying to figure out, okay, how do we then respond to that? And how do we find a way to, Trump has also kind of been like, well, Europe needs to step up. Realistically, Europe doesn't have the ability to sort of perform militarily without, as Keir Starmer says, that sort of US backstop. And so if Lavrov, and yes, it's true, Lavrov does lie, but also they are still using kind of the diplomatic language of, pre-Trump era, that where specific words allow for, a little bit of wiggle room and so on. What the sort of next steps are. I mean, the thing that I was quite interested in actually was that these talks were happening in Saudi, right? And also in sort of in a place where Saudi is positioning itself as the neutral ground more and more, a place where, they sort of have the US on one side and Trump, who they sort of like, and Putin on the other. And it seems to me that's also quite an interesting addition once we start to look at what else is happening in the region.
On the subject of wiggle room as well, Stephen, it struck me reading what has come out of these discussions in the last day or so that possibly the most significant one, you would know better than I would though, Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, says Ukraine, and I quote, has a sovereign right, which is pretty big talk from the Russians, to join the European Union. Now, does that strike you as the likeliest way out of this for everybody, in that Ukraine, or at least the bit of it that Russia doesn't keep, gets to join the EU, and Russia knows that that's sort of a security guarantee, but it can then go back to its people and say we kept them out of NATO, and Ukraine thinks, well, maybe this is a West Germany, East Germany situation, we let that bit go, maybe we get it back a few decades now from now.
It was certainly a significant comment from Peskov, and yes, even I raised my eyebrows. But at the same time, it's a way also of throwing a stone into the EU pool, because, of course, not everyone in the EU might want Ukraine to join, and there have always been very strict rules and regulations that have more or less been applied to any country that applied to join the EU. And, for example, Hungary or Slovakia might turn around and say, actually, no, we don't want Ukraine in there. So, yes, in a way, it seemed to be a concession. But at the same time, Peskov doesn't come out and say things without thinking hard about them first or without being told what to say. But he's no fool. And so he knows that he is actually stirring things up in the European Union by saying something like that.
But just a final quick thought on this one, Stephen, before we move on. If that's what the final framework looks anything like, can President Putin really go back to the Russian people after 3 years of war, extraordinary economic turmoil, and by most estimates about 800,000 casualties, with a map which has barely changed in 3 years, and go, I won, go me?
He can, because of his own propaganda machine. That's something which we should never forget. A lot of Russians now put the war out of their mind. They try and just live normal lives. They're aware that the price of potatoes rose by 80% last year and the price of eggs by 90%. And certain aspects of life have been harder. But a lot of people, possibly 40% of the Russian population, have actually done quite well out of this war. They've been earning more money. And they are constantly bombarded by this propaganda and have been for many years. I mean, they've had at least 15 or 20 years of Ukraine being considered as a non-country and this shouldn't exist and so on. And you find when you talk to Russians, certainly those who aren't living in the West and haven't been exposed to the other side of the story, that they have tended to, it's like osmosis, they accept this. And if Putin were to go back and say, look, we've got peace, some people, yes, would raise the issue of the number of casualties there have been, and Russia has suffered, in terms of numbers, they've suffered far more casualties than Ukraine. But Putin would still, his propaganda machine would make sure that he would spin this as a win of some sort. The bigger problem then for Russia, and this is something they're beginning to talk about in certain circles, is the number of these angry, often criminals, who've been fighting, who have weapons. There'll be so many weapons throughout Russia who've gone back. There's been at least 500 murders already committed by people who were at the front line, who had been released from prison, possibly by Wagner, who've gone back. And so there is going to be an undercurrent of violence and chaos and crime in Russia, whatever happens. But Putin will still try and spin this as a win.
Well, to Sudan now, the people of which for nearly 2 years have been victims first and foremost of a dreadful civil war, but also of the order of priorities that much of the world applies to conflicts. African conflicts struggle for attention at the quietest of times, while major conflagrations are occurring in Europe and the Middle East simultaneously. They are barely regarded at all. But there are some suggestions that maybe an end is in sight. Sudan's armed forces appear to be making progress, evicting the rebel faction Rapid Support Forces from Khartoum. Yasmin, while we have you here, are you able to hear anything or glean anything from friends and family still in Sudan about how things are moving?
So things are changing, and it's quite interesting. But there's a couple of things that I think it's worth bearing in mind when hearing the kind of news that's coming out of Sudan at the moment. Because what you'll hear often is this framing that the Sudanese armed forces are sort of liberating Khartoum, the capital city, again, as they liberated, quote unquote, Wad Madani, which is, the capital of Jazeera state, which is the sort of breadbasket of the country. Now, the thing to remember is that the Sudanese armed forces is the very sort of military dictatorship apparatus that the Sudanese people worked so hard to remove from power 5 years ago.
Important to remember that this is not your good guys versus bad guys scenario.
Exactly. And the reason I say that is because the way that the Sudanese armed forces will then operate once they quote-unquote liberated place is not like a sort of a peaceful civilian movement. What they are doing, and there is evidence now that they've done in Medani, for example, is anybody that they deem might be related to the Rapid Support Forces, the paramilitary group, or they might deem as, quote-unquote, a foreigner, and that is purely on quite racist and tribal lines, they execute, right? And so there have been swathes of extrajudicial judicial executions, and also they will use the pretense of this as a way to remove anyone who is a critic of them. And so what we are seeing is, yes, there is a shift, but it's also interesting as to why there's been this shift, because for most of the war, the conversation analysts have been saying is, it's unlikely that there will be a pure military solution, right? Or there will be a pure military win. That tends not to be the case in Sudan. But in this counter-revolutionary war, what we've seen is both sides, the RSF and the SAF, the paramilitary and the traditional armed forces, have had arms and weapons supplied from the outside. So the RSF has the Emiratis, the UAE, and then on the other side, you had Egypt and Iran. And also, the Russians were playing both sides. Now we've seen the Russians really position themselves to support the Sudanese armed forces. And in fact, Lavrov met with the current foreign minister in Morocco just a few days ago. And the foreign minister, ostensibly the foreign minister of Sudan, said that, they had agreed that they will be now building a Russian naval port in the Red Sea in Port Sudan. Now, again, this was not confirmed by Lavrov, but what's interesting about this is it's sort of, now that things have changed in Syria, now that they're looking to shore up their sort of power base or their position, Russia's looking to shore up its position in the region, and Iran is also looking for new kind of allies, it's really worth paying attention to the sort of movements that are happening. So I think often people think of this conflict as just a play between two sides of a military. But actually, what we're seeing is all of the shifts that are happening in the region play out initially in Sudan, and that will kind of, have further ramifications.
Well, on that subject of Russia's involvement in this, Stephen, as Yasmin points out, we have had the bizarre circumstance, and actually we did see this occasionally in Syria as well, and in Libya, of Russia effectively fighting on both sides. So we did have Russia supporting the Sudanese armed forces, Wagner Group supporting the RSF. Is that just as straightforward as Russia thinking, well, we win either way?
Basically, yes. The difference now, you mentioned the Wagner Group, of course, which has effectively collapsed now after Prigozhin's mutiny, say with a question mark, but in June 23, and then his death, certainly in August 23. And so it doesn't mean that Russia has pulled out or pulled all its people out of Sudan or other parts of Africa. It just means it's now more official. So they'd placed this private military company, as they always call Wagner, and there are others too, and they were doing the dirty work, whereas now the Russians have basically said, I'll try and keep this polite, I almost said something rude there, but the Russians say, well, forget it. We don't mind if people know what we're doing. And yes, and it's interesting that, as Yasmin was saying, they've now come down on the side of the army in Sudan.
Which does then kind of give you an indication for where things might end up, right? Because the other interesting thing is that the RSF has been losing ground. Now, also in Darfur and in the west, where they kind of have their main base, they continue to hold on to a lot of the territory. And what we're seeing is that there is a sort of parallel government being formed in Nairobi that's much more allied with the RSF. So the worst case scenario is actually then you sort of have you have the Sudanese armed forces kind of having Khartoum and Madani in the sort of east and center, and then you have the RSF on the other side.
But at the same time, the Russians are going to be careful because of what they saw happen in Syria. Because, of course, you mentioned Syria before, and it's very relevant here because, they were backing Assad all the way and then started bombing again. And then suddenly, whoops, it's all gone to pieces in Syria. And they were made to look very stupid and have egg on their faces. So whilst they will be backing one side now, as you've said, they will be trying to be careful not to be labelled again with a side that's going to lose. Right. So they presumably are fairly confident the army is the future.
The other thing that I thought was interesting is why have the fortunes of the RSF changed? And now the UAE has been reported now to have been the main supplier of weapons to the RSF. The US, there were some US Congress people or lawmakers who really pushed the UAE at the end of last year to to confirm that they wouldn't send any more weapons to the RSF. Now, they have always denied sending any weapons, but they sort of said, well, from now on, we won't be sending any more. And although, whether or not they have or haven't, there is a question mark if the UAE has decided, okay, perhaps it's too difficult, or, we didn't quite realize what we were getting ourselves into. If there is slowly pulling support from the RSF militarily, then that might explain some of these shifts.
Well, to Spain now, which is one of very few European jurisdictions with a government willing to make a positive case for migration, and which appears to be seeing positive results as a consequence. At a time when many European economies are stumbling or limping, Spain's is positively skipping along, posting annual growth of 3.2%, racking up record tourist numbers and getting its long chronic unemployment under some sort of control. Though 10% is still horrible, even if falling, it is the lowest for 16 years. Very possibly not coincidentally, the Socialist Workers' Party-led government of Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez has been enthusiastic about immigration, pitching the country a choice between being open and prosperous or closed off and poor. Stephen, first of all, is the problem perhaps that in quite a lot of Western democracies, a reasonable plurality of the people, push come to shove, would rather be closed and poor than open and prosperous?
Closed and poor? I mean, closed to immigrants? Well, the way things are at the moment, yes, I think it's very sad. But this story I find very encouraging. I think it's, just on a personal level, I think it's absolutely appalling the way immigrants are being bashed all over Europe at the moment, and even in You're
just saying that because you're outnumbered in this studio, Stephen. we come over here, we host all your podcasts.
Yeah, work and pay taxes. Most people, this is the thing. This is all. Buy the sweaters. You see, keep the economy on the Shetland Isles going. No, seriously, I think I very much like Spain, and that's maybe I'm a bit biased, but I think it's a real good news story at a time when you've got the sort of tragedies in Germany and other places, and in this country we've the conservative opposition, the former government, now seem to be going out of their way to be as right-wing as possible, because there's this party called the Reform Party who are very nasty and very right-wing and hate immigrants.
But this is the same Conservative Party that, whether they did it deliberately or otherwise, presided over one of the most spectacular immigration booms in the history of the United Kingdom.
Yes, but they tried not to and said they weren't. And in fact, they're now led by someone who is an immigrant as well. It's all rather hypocritical, I feel, with the Conservatives. But no, I mean, the growth is there in Spain. And, and the fact is, and this is one of the things that gets me so angry when people on the right talk about immigrants in such derogatory terms. The fact is that the vast majority of immigrants coming into any country in Europe want to work, will pay their taxes, and the economy benefits. And if we're open-minded enough to other cultures, we all benefit.
Well, would it work here, though, thinking about the United Kingdom, Yasmin, if Sir Keir Starmer, for example, gave a speech which was basically what Stephen just said?
I think part of the challenge, and you pointed to it, Andrew, when you made that comment about the Tories, the Conservative government at the time in the UK, presiding over this huge immigration boom, while also at the same time having this awful cultural rhetoric around.
It was quite confusing.
It was, and I think but I think this is part of the strategy, right? I think one of the challenges we have is that the cultural narrative, the political narrative, there is no narrative around migration that is seen positively. So it is very politically challenging, because many left-wing governments across Europe have actually, unfortunately, started to go further right on immigration in particular, because they feel like they've lost ground. They feel like it's actually impossible. And that's a narrative win for, far-right groups and so on. Because if you look to sort of a previous version of conversations around immigrants, I mean, so a couple of things I also want to draw out from the story. It is the case that Europeans are getting older and they are having fewer children. Mm-hmm. And it is just factually true that over time, if there is no immigration, their economies will collapse and so on in a way that they won't be able to fix. And so you have this terrible cycle, because the economy is becoming worse, but you blame it on immigrants even though immigrants are the only people that will save you, which is a kind of, and so it sort of continues. Now, Spain, having had this shift for a couple of years, I think what will be most interesting, I'm quite hopeful. I said to my husband, let's move to Spain. I shall learn Spanish from Netflix, because they have subtitles. That'll be the way I'll do it. But in 5 to 10 years' time, when you've sort of, that's been the policy for a number of years, will people still feel as positive as they do now, when the pain of not having immigration has sort of faded?
But one of the problems in this country is that a number of people come across in very dodgy craft and are illegal immigrants who come on and
the optics of which are horrible.
Yeah, and they should never be on board these vessels to cross the channel, and they're overcrowded, and sadly there are some number of deaths. But that's what reform and the right wing takes is, those are the immigrants. And actually, they're a tiny percentage of the immigrants. Most immigrants actually, come on planes and come to work and as I say, pay taxes. But that's what it's a question of educating the population as well, our own population. That that it's very easy to point the finger at that and say, "Oh, look, that's the problem of immigration." That's a tiny part of it. The majority of immigrants are good people wanting to do a good job.
Well, I just will finally on this, Yasmin, put to you what strikes me as the eternal question about immigration, because I can never quite work this out myself. When I try to be optimistic about this, I kind of think what people dislike or are fearful of, it's not immigration and immigrants themselves, but it's the appearance of chaos, the idea that there's no process, that nobody's in charge. That makes people nervous. The counter I always put to the hysteria about the people on the boats is that in recent years, I think I'm right, more or less right about the numbers. Something like 160,000 people from Hong Kong have moved to the United Kingdom. That is a very visible ethnic minority arriving suddenly in large numbers of different language, different faith. Nobody cares. It's not an issue at all because people understand, okay, there's a reason, there's a logic, there's a process, there's documentation.
There's a history too.
And there's a history.
I think part of it is process, yes. Part of it is, broader kind of structural, whether it's racisms and so on. But actually, I also think the truth is people dislike change, and people at scale dislike change. If you've got too many of any kind of person, if you've got too many people who drink oat milk moving into your neighborhood, people have an issue with that as well.
That actually would be calamitous.
Right. And so I think there is something to be said for how do we, and to your points even about education, what does it look like for us as societies to get better at managing change? And some of it is process, some of it is being quite honest about what's going on. Some of it is telling different stories. But I think, this will not immigration is not going to decrease in our world, right? As much as people will try to make the borders as hard as they possibly can, climate change, war, etc., it's going to continue. So the question is, are you getting on board? Not to make a boat joke, or sorry, terrible, but or what are you going to do about it? Because the sea is rising nonetheless.
Well, now I fear to a stiff challenge to the two Australian constituents of this panel to overcome, for the purposes of light radio banter, the traditional ironclad reluctance of our people to make any fun whatsoever of our slightly less handsome cousins across the Tasman. New Zealand tourist authorities have incurred an amount of incredulous mockery with a new campaign aimed at encouraging more Australians to visit their country. Public anger in New Zealand has been roused not by, as might be expected, the thought of more Australians arriving, but by the choice of slogan, "Everyone must go," believed by many to be somewhat jarring at a time when record numbers of Kiwis, wearied of exorbitant living costs and dwindling opportunities, are doing exactly that in the opposite direction. Yasmin, my thought was, the solution's right there. There's those posters in Murray's office in Flight of the Conchords. The slogans on those, like Scotland but further, don't expect too much, you'll love it, and not part of Australia. I mean, that's the next 3 campaigns written for them.
Done and dusted.
Yeah.
I mean, they in the article that I read about this, which I just really enjoyed, was the sense that everyone made fun of this because it sounded like a clearance ad. And to me, it just when my family first moved to Brisbane, Australia, there was an ad on television for a shop called Rugs A Million, and it had this.
What did they sell?
Well, pottery, and everything must go. They sort of yelled it at the screen, and my parents, having just arrived, they were like, "Oh my God, there's this huge sale!" So they went out and bought a load of rugs, not realizing that this is just a genre of advert.
I mean, this is a whole other conversation. Now that I think of it, there's about a dozen specific local business television commercials from mid-1980s Sydney I can still recite all of. I'm not going to, but I could. Stephen, do you have any particular favourite clangers in the world of tourism advertising? Is what we want to talk about, at which point I must give a shout out to the graphic design department of Pakistan International Airways, who quite recently, and I promise you I'm not making this up, put up an online poster of one of their jets heading towards the Eiffel Tower with the slogan, "Paris, we're coming today."
Oh no! You know.
We're talking aeroplanes. I suppose that's the one that immediately comes to mind for me. There was in post-Soviet Russia, and no longer in post-Soviet Russia, there was an airline called Transaero, and Transaero some years ago came out with a slogan. In a poll, we were voted the 10th safest airline in the world. Shortly after this, Transaero collapsed. We're in the top 10. Surely, don't you know how bad is your English? But coming back to this one,
10th safest.
The 10th safest. Yes, no, quite exactly. But going back to this, New Zealand, everyone must go. Can I add one to your list of what might come next? I think the next one actually might, because everyone must go seems to be encouraging New Zealanders to leave. The next campaign should say, "Would the last person to leave please turn off the lights?"
Well, I mean, this is which is one of the jokes that Australians have reluctantly been making about Australians for many years. I can recall, in fact, when Auckland had a huge blackout many years ago. I promise you that is how almost every Australian reporter covering the story finished. If you flick from channel to channel, you could see them all rushing to be first with the gag. Seriously, though, New Zealand can do better than this, surely. But there are many genuine. It's a lovely country.
I mean, they had the Lord of the Rings film there, did they not? I mean,
really, they don't mention that very often.
Oh God, I think I've really tanked my New Zealand. Not that I had much New Zealand credits, but they're sort of slowly decreasing. I mean, genuinely, New Zealand is a beautiful place. It is
overcompensating furiously. Seriously, Yasmin, the closest in my life I think I've ever understood what it must be like to be you for a week was I once made fun of New Zealand in The Guardian from the point of view of an Australian. I was on television in New Zealand every night for a week. I'm serious. Members of my family got called by local newspapers.
If it helps, so when somebody meets a Sudanese person who isn't Sudanese, they'll often be like, "Oh, do you know so-and-so?" Because all Sudanese people know each other. But somebody did once ask me if I knew this one Sudanese guy from New Zealand. I was like, "Mohammed, actually I do. I do."
Mohammed, if you're listening, hello. Yasmin Abdul-Majid and Stephen Dalziel, thank you both for joining us. Finally, on today's show, if you needed any confirmation of the surging importance of the Gulf region of the Middle East in international affairs and perhaps the decline of Europe's significance, today's headlines are ample. Not so long ago, the natural venue for a summit involving the United States and Russia would have been Geneva or even Reykjavik. It is now Riyadh. The official whose brief is maintaining relations between Europe and the Gulf is EU Special Representative for the Gulf, currently former Italian Foreign Minister Luigi Di Maio. I spoke to Luigi Di Maio at the Munich Security Conference this past weekend and began by asking how he saw thinking in the Gulf states about the future of Gaza evolving.
Can see Saudi very involved in the Global Alliance initiative for the two-state solution on Gaza, Qatar very involved in the Gaza ceasefire, but even Emirates for the exchange of prisoners between Ukraine and Russia, and Oman and Qatar again in the mediation between US and Iran. And there are many other files where they are crucial. So what is happening there is that on one side there is a huge economic growth, mainly linked to the fact that they are implementing their vision program in a new way. where now they are attracting the investments in their domestic economies, not only investing abroad. And second, there is a huge ambition on the multilateral side in even representing or speaking sometimes on behalf of the causes of the global south.
Okay.
In particular, after the war in Ukraine, the Russian aggression against Ukraine, it's clear that that region is becoming a pole between the two poles, the polarization of the war.
I mean, that being the case, and I'm thinking about the fact that there was the first ever EU Gulf Cooperation Council summit in October, is there something of a scramble for influence going on in the Gulf between the EU and Russia?
Honestly, the main point is that European Union in 2022 decided to approve a new strategy towards the Gulf, in particular towards the GCC. This strategy is called Joint Communication for a Strategic Partnership with EU and GCC, between EU and GCC. And what we created in the last 2 years is a new kind of structured dialogues and cooperations along initiatives that are linked to 5 pillars: trade, investments, regional security, people to people, and partnerships between the institutions. These 5 pillars are the core of my mandate. I am in charge for implementing the strategy of the European Union. When it comes to security now, the summit is the most important, is the peak of this implementation during the last year, because of course the leaders, they met for the first ever time in Brussels. But there is even a new structured security dialogue, EU-GCC as senior officials, where we are discussing about maritime security, cyber security, counter-terrorism. There are many other formats, even in terms of business fora, investment fora. And then there is a project of working together about the liberalization of the visa for our students, researchers, investors, entrepreneurs. And on the trade side, many cooperations on the renewable energies. Countries like Saudi, but even Oman, UAE, they will be the main supplier of hydrogen by 2030 at world level. So when it comes to the relations of European Union and the Gulf, since during the last 2 years we made a huge step ahead, but it's not enough. I'm not totally happy yet. We have to do our best. Of course, we are working a lot in the framework of the Global Alliance for the Two-State Solution with these countries, but I'm very interested now at the so-called plan that it seems will be discussed in the Arab world for Gaza.
But on that subject of a two-state solution, seriously, how invested are the Gulf countries, or how interested are the Gulf countries in actually getting involved with trying to make that happen? Because that is going to cost a lot of money, a lot of resources, a lot of diplomatic and political capital. And there has always been this thing where the Gulf countries have prided themselves on being stable and orderly and prosperous, whereas the Levantine Arab states tend towards chaos. Do they really want to get involved in this?
I think that first of all we have to consider that there is a huge political sensitiveness of their public opinions in the Gulf.
Sure.
These are countries that for the 75% are under 35, with youth that are the majority of the country and are very sensitive about that. So the rulers, they have to take into account that, and they want to take into account that. This is clear, and they are very involved. Second, they know very well that they are not an island in the Middle East. Everything they do in terms of economic development is linked to the stability of the region, at the equation of security of the entire region, not only the Gulf, the rest of the Middle East, and even some pieces of Northern Africa, Horn of Africa, and even the Indian Ocean sometimes. So they know very well that. And in order to face this new era of domestic investments and even sensitiveness of their youth, they have to be involved, but they want to be involved. And after October 7, they know very well that their leadership will be fundamental. Obviously, not only the GCC, but countries like Egypt, Jordan, the Arab League, in the entire Arab League. Sometimes they use even the format Arab League plus the Organization for the Islamic Cooperation. So these are organizations together with the GCC that are growing in terms of multilateral efforts for the Middle East, and not only the Middle East.
I mean, has there been in those conversations at this conference a bit of an overlap with, I guess, all the other conversations that would have been going on about Ukraine and about the United States? Because obviously Vice President Vance's speech really set the tone for most of this conference. But of course, it's not just Ukraine that we've heard some, let's say, unorthodox ideas about from this new American administration. What have they been saying, the Gulf states, their representatives you've been speaking to, about the major idea we've had from the United States for a future settlement involves displacing the entire population of Gaza and turning the Strip into a holiday camp?
Honestly, I see the Gulf states in a very coherent position since the beginning of this war, since the Russian aggression against Ukraine started. Because they voted with us. We had the same position at United Nations General Assembly on the resolution for the sovereignty of Ukraine. They continue to advocate for the sovereignty of Ukraine, but at the same time, they have their relations with Russia that sometimes were even important for the exchange of prisoners, for instance, but even for the returning of children, Ukrainian children to Ukraine, mediated by Qatar. So during the last 3 years of war, we as Europeans, as Western community, we engaged a lot with them in order to speak with the other side and to try to fix some specific issues.
That was Luigi Di Maio, EU Special Representative for the Gulf and former Italian Foreign Minister, speaking to me at the Munich Security Conference. That is all for this edition of The Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Yasmin Abdul-Majid and Stephen Diel. Today's show was produced by Monica Lillis and researched by Maisie Ringer. Our sound engineer was Elliot Greenfield. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.